early San Angelo businesses, I start with Richard Tankersley, who was the first ranchman in the area in 1864. There's still Native Americans around, so he's really brave. He brought 700 head of longhorn. His wife, Ann, they first lived at the head of the South Concho River, then Spring Creek. Then he did very well when he got a contract with Fort Concho to provide beef. And the processing plant was near the central fire station. Now, if you've ever been near a rendering plant or feedlot, I don't think it did very well near downtown. But anyway, Ann and Tankersley divorced, and she built a hotel called the Concho House. And in the 82 flood, it was adobe and it went away. But anyway, she was very successful in her hotel business. Then a relative of mine is George Washington DeLong. He arrived from Kentucky in 1865 and settled at Lipan Springs. How many have ever seen the rocking chair ranch in the Lipan Springs? It's absolutely an oasis. And GW built the spring house out there that's still standing. And I visited there and I was like, what were you thinking leaving? But he moved closer to Christoval. And Christoval originally was called DeLong. I don't know why it changed to Christoval. It was a large family, and he purchased 3,840 acres in the Christoval area. Irrigation, provided milk, butter, eggs to Fort Concho. He was one of the 5 commissioners appointed to organize Tom Green County, and all kinds of siblings followed him. William, David, Samuel, Francis, and Arminta, my great-grandmother, they all came here because opportunities were excellent, and I still have Kentucky relatives that descend, but there are a whole lot of Texas relatives. Joseph Funk and Philip Lee brought the first Hereford cattle to the area. Philip C. Lee's ranch was at where our airport is today. That was where he had the headquarters. I'm still looking for a picture of that house. I have a picture of his house in downtown San Angelo. And of course, it's a parking lot today, but it was a beautiful 2-story brick house. And the brick was brought in by wagon. Can you imagine how heavy? Eugene McCronan, if I pronounce anything incorrectly, let me know. He was an Irishman who arrived in the area during the construction of Fort Concho, established the first dairy farm near the Lone Wolf Bridge, furnished the fort with milk and butter. He bought 10 sections of land on the Middle Concho, and he also bought a brewery called Rock Bluff. He probably made more money doing brewing than he did ranching. Joseph Tweedy, if you're an Episcopalian, a lot of the things in the Episcopal Church have his name on it. He was from New York, and I didn't realize his extended family made a lot of money in the clothing manufacturing business, and they made uniforms for the Union Army. Tweedy and his partner, Morgan and Lawrence Grindle and Barlow Reynolds, arrived with the first sheep in the area in 1877, served as a county commissioner, bank director, leader of the Wool Growers Association, and a civic leader. The ranch was called the Knickerbocker. Didn't know that, after a fictional character in a Washington Irving's book. Little tidbits.
We used to do the Santa Fe Trail Ride.
Yes.
And we rode across the Tweedy Ranch 3 years ago.
Excellent. Riding history. Excellent.
Right there on the Spring Creek.
On Spring Creek, yes. My grandfather was born on Spring Creek before the Austin family moved to Coke County. Question?
The Tweedy Ranch was next to Allen Ranch at Christoval, where I lived with my husband on Allen Lane, the Allen Ranch.
Excellent. Yes. If you're a descendant of anybody I speak about, please raise your hand. There are people, I love to look at the generations that have followed and what has happened to the property or the business, or what did those kids do. So many of the girls were shipped east, and they married Eastern fellas and never moved back. But a lot of times the guys would inherit the land and continue with the ranch. Of course, you've got to have an oil well or two to keep in business. And some were lucky. Whoops. All right, Monroe Pulliam Street, born and raised in Uvalde. And this guy was good with the dollar, according to what I read. He worked for other ranches, and he saved every dime so he could buy his own cattle. He'd put his cattle on his dad's land, and when he had enough, he found his own property. He arrived in San Angelo in 1874. He retired from ranching in 1916 and devoted his time in the banking business. And he was also instrumental in establishing the public schools. These are two of his homes. The one on your left is called Belmont, but I didn't know that until I did a little bit more research on the old homes that I did. T.P. Bell bought this and it became known as Belmont, and it was at the end of Spalding. It was at the corner of Spalding and Bell, and it became the indigent home for the county. And they had about 12 poor people that lived there. And of course, they tore it down. But there was a beautiful home, isn't it? And then the home of Pulliam, the second home, was on the corner of Beauregard and Randolph, and it's now a parking lot next to the county clerk office. All right, John Arden, also a sheep man who arrived in 1877. He committed suicide down on the corner where the Vec building was located. He had planned this, and there's no story about why he killed himself, but he arranged all his business affairs and made sure his wife inherited everything. His wife was Katie. The value of this estate was over $20,000, so Arden did very well. She stayed in the area, and they moved to Ben Ficklin. And in 1882, they were on top of the roof, one of the roofs of a house, and they were saved. They soon moved to California. She was a music teacher, and son Oliver had a career in the Merchant Marines, and daughter Elsie married John Brecknell and became a well-known opera star worldwide. Elsie received a special award in 1917 from the French government for her services to the wounded in the war. See, I find the tidbits of the kids. And there she is. Now, come to find out, the husband's looking for her to file divorce papers. And in the paper it says, well, I don't know where she is. You have to remember there's no good communication back then, so she could go to France and help the wounded and sing. But eventually she, I just thought this was really cool that she received this honor. And she survived. She was just a baby in the 1882 flood of Ben Ficklin. She survives, and look what happens. Jonathan Miles, you may live in the Miles edition. He bought a lot of land, but he brought the first Jersey cattle to Tom Green County. Really believed in the future of San Angelo, and he bought a section of land that's 640 acres. In 1877 in the town that would become San Angelo. And there's it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Marcus Coningheim and Jonathan Miles, this lawsuit over land went all the way to the Supreme Court of Texas, and Jonathan won. After the Ben Ficklin flood, he gave home sites in that land for free to people who'd lost everything. That's very generous. He gave land and money in order for the railroad to be established. He gave land for a high school and the cemetery. All of you all probably know the old cemetery is off of Oaks, and what used to be the freshman campus was built on top of the old cemetery, and they don't have all the bodies. There were 277 people buried in that cemetery, and they have not all been found. Jonathan's father married 3 times. Jonathan was one of 16 children. He ventured out of Missouri, and so if you have relatives with the Miles last name and they live in Missouri, most likely you're kin to this family. He married 4 times. Jonathan married 4 times, and there were 13 children. So, anybody here a descendant of Jonathan Miles? His daughter Susan, who I come across her research, fabulous historian, and she did it the old-fashioned way. Phone calls, letter writing, just visiting courthouses. That's the old-fashioned way. My research is pretty much done with her work online and all the other great historians of San Angelo. Okay, of course, Fort Concho is a business established in 1867 to protect the settlement and protect the buffalo hunters, stage and mail lines, and the fort became home of the 4th and 10th Cavalry at full strength. Did you realize there are 400 to 500 men at the fort? Bismarck Farms, 2,300 acres, 1868, 7 miles from the fort. Now, you can't get in to see that land because it is behind a locked gate, and I don't know if this building is still standing. When you go down the Grand Canal Road and it does the big sharp 90-degree turn, Bismarck Farms would be to your right. German immigrants, including Gustav Schleicher, county name for him. He was an investor. The Germans are smart. You know, they came to New Braunfels and Fredericksburg, and they're always looking for opportunities. Hard workers. Lots of Germans came here. They established a garden that provided produce to Fort Concho. They did 3 crops of hay a season. That's a lot. Land was sold to Henry Milam Taylor of Menard for $10,000 in gold. Those German investors did just fine. And of course, lots of turnover after that. The Concho Mail Station, 640 acres, was purchased by Ben Ficklin on the Concho River, 3 miles south of Fort Concho in January 1869. Ficklin had been involved previously to the stage lines in Alabama before the war, and he is credited with the idea for the Pony Express, Missouri to California. I did a talk recently on just Ben Ficklin. Total character. Very smart, fearless. The mail station was an important stop on the San Antonio to El Paso stage line. F.C. Taylor, a friend of Ben's, was to be manager. The community that grew near the station would be named Ben Ficklin after Ficklin's death in 1871, and he died of a fish bone stuck in his throat. And when the doctor tried to take it out, they think that he nicked an artery and he bled to death. I myself have had a fish bone stuck in my throat when I was in college, so I relate to Ben Ficklin. Of course, the town became the county seat of Tom Green County from 1875 to 1882. And you can go down the Ben Ficklin Road toward the San Angelo Country Club, and to your right, there are a lot of houses in the flood zone, and that was where the town of Ben Ficklin was. This is what the courthouse looked like. It was a stone building. It's actually a picture of the school on Magdalen, the first public school on Magdalen Street. Now, the occupations around the mail station you wonder why not everybody lived in San Angelo. Well, Ben Ficklin became where the nicer people lived. My great-grandparents lived in San Angelo in an adobe house. I don't know why they didn't live in Ben Ficklin, but he was a carpenter and lots was going on downtown. But there were blacksmiths, wheelwrights, paint shops, stage drivers, servants, agents, teamsters, carpenters, clerks, and storekeepers. There were stores. There's a saloon out there. There was a mercantile store at Ben Ficklin. So it was a happening place too. Of course, 1882, the flood rose to the second floor. And we know now that that's when San Angelo became the county seat after the flood. San Angelo was either called Fort Concho, across the river, over there, wherever. It catered to the military man. If you've ever been in the area of Killeen, Copper's Cove, I went through military town on the East Coast, you're going to have businesses that cater to the soldier. In my research, Henry B. Link and William Lardon, historically credited with the first business in San Angelo. It says they were ex-sergeants at the fort. There's no research that establishes that. Now, the article it mentions these two people is 1924 historic article about San Angelo. But here they are on the 1870 census. William Lardon and Henry B. Link, and they owned a mercantile store. Businesses at those early times were made of pickets, which is just a stick, mud to cover the cracks, and buffalo hides. Okay, all right. Now, I have to mention that Hispanics were the backbone of this area because they're doing the physical labor of the people that have established businesses. And we cannot forget their contribution. And the same with the black soldiers. Okay, let's talk about Bartholomew DeWitt. Okay, DeWitt was a businessman in San Antonio, and I've looked up his little tiny ad in the San Antonio paper, and it's a little tiny ad, and he's selling quinine. That's the only thing he's advertising. So he convinces Marcus Koningheim to give him $1,500 to buy land, and well, he borrows $1,500, and he buys 320 acres in the north side of Concho River. The first businesses are established where Miss Hattie's is, that's block 1. And the first businesses were on that block, facing south. Magdalene is named for DeWitt's sister-in-law, who was a nun. She was known as Mother Magdalene. Twohig's named for a banker friend. I did not know where Twohig, that's a very strange name, San Antonio banker. Chadburn's named for Second Lieutenant Theodore Chadburn, who died in the Mexican War. He was from Maine, and they have a historical marker dedicated to him in Maine. And he was a West Point graduate. His sash and saber are on display at Fort Chadburn. Take a trip to Fort Chadburn. Okay, DeWitt married really well people. 1855 to Carolina Angela de la Garza, very prominent family in San Antonio. The Texas county of Garza is named for this family. She was well educated at an Ursuline convent in Galveston. Unfortunately, she died young, 1866, and she'd had 5 children: Bart Jr., Blake, Catherine, Joseph, and Caroline. The town was named for her. You're going to see misinformation when you read about San Angelo, but the town was named San Angela, and then finally San Angelo in her honor. Okay? And of course, the town originally was known as Fort Concho, and the other is across the river. This is, if you haven't seen this at the Chamber of Commerce, these are the sculptures of Caroline and Saint Angela Merici, who was an Italian nun from the 1500s who believed in service to the church through education of the girls. And the nun is on the right, and she's holding a book, and it represents knowledge. And Caroline Angela admired this nun, so John Noelke created these sculptures, and it's just a beautiful location. So, time to go visit. DeWitt defaulted on his $1,500 loan. Now, the only reason Marcus probably gave the money is because of his connections to the De La Garzas, who had been there already 150 years in San Antonio. So all of a sudden, Coningheim owns all this land in San Antonio, and he tries to trade his property for a barrel of whiskey. And the whiskey was considered more valuable than the property. Marcus was not happy. He never lived in San Angelo, but his brother, Alexander, did. And he managed any of the property, sales, encouraging giving land for churches, encouraging the property for schools. And Alexander's home was on the corner of Coningheim and Tuig. I have no idea what it looks like. Still searching for a lot of the old homes. Of course, St. Angela became a town of gamblers, saloons, and prostitutes, and that's another story in itself. That's another presentation, all catering to the soldiers. I tell you, the saloon keepers made a lot of money, and they're smart because they're then investing in land. And then they put their money into banks, and they become bankers, and then they do okay once Prohibition starts. And there were like 19 saloons before Prohibition in San Angelo. Now, some men took the chance and opened businesses in the days before San Angelo became the county seat, and one of those people is Mr. Veck, Willie Veck. He arrived in 1860 as a government wagon master. When the Army regulations changed, he opened his own business on the northeast corner of Concho Avenue. It's a parking lot. Okay, today it's a parking lot next to Letty's. He would open the first saloon and bank. Now, banks are unregistered this time. There's no federal control. Anybody can open a bank. He also sold merchandise, and the Veck residence was right next door, and it was picket fence with mud and buffalo hide top. Lovely place to bring your bride. Okay. He was in business with Sterrett and Sherwood as cattle ranchers. Now, his business is that Veck Sterrett building next, where it would have been next to Letty's, if it's still standing. And you can see some of the original businesses. I'll talk about Johnson and Taylor, the San Angelo National Bank, the hardware store, the Lepowskis. There was a bakery. A.J. Potter was the baker, not the minister. Talk about confusion. A grocery store, the Lepowskis had a mercantile store and a grocery store, and then Veck Sterrett had another merchandise store. This is the south side of Concho, the Nimitz Hotel, and that Nimitz, yes, kin to the Admiral Nimitz. Okay, all the same family from Fredericksburg, and he opened a hotel here, Ernst. Next to Ernst was a bakery and a watchmaker. Then there was a gambling den, and behind the saloon, the Gray Mule Saloon, merchandise, liquor, saloon, gambling, saloon billiards, shoe candy, tailor, saloon, bank. Everybody's thirsty. Yes. This is a picture from celebrating the first bale of cotton. It's a pretty cool picture. Okay. William Henry Wisdom was a Canadian that arrived in the US around 1876, and he found his way to sell furniture in San Angelo. And this is his ad, W.H. Wisdom. Don't know what happened to him after he closed shop. Morkins and Company was a general merchandise also, and dry goods, clothing, boots, and shoes. Fitzpatrick actually had worked for McCloskey before he made enough money, I guess, to build this really substantial saloon, the Fitzpatrick Building, 1884. Well, he's Irish and he has a temper. Yeah. So he shot R.A. Ewing in the hand. He pled guilty to aggravated assault and got off with a fine of $176. In 1896, he murdered in his saloon F.S. Allen. Many witnesses were afraid to testify, so the trial was transferred to Erath County, that's Stephenville. John was found guilty. I found his prison record online. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to state penitentiary in Huntsville for 12 years. He was pardoned 4 years later. He moved to Miami, Arizona, owned a saloon in Arizona with his son, John Jr., died in 1933. The obituary mentions nothing of his troubles in San Angelo. Now, if you look, Eggemeyer's has it's not the same building, but I love Eggemeyer's rendition of the front is very similar to the front of the old Fitzpatrick Saloon. It's just kind of, I didn't make a comparison. I was going, I've seen that picture before. But, okay, Charlie Vroman, general merchandise, first located on the west side of Chadbourn in an adobe building. Then, with partner Fred Nason, opened a store that included groceries, dry goods, and clothing. You recognize the building? This location became the Arc Light Saloon in 1892, northeast corner of Concho and Chadbourn, and it's now a clock repair shop. And it's kind of an interesting, go in there, it's real crowded and everything, but you're standing in history there. It's a great location. Tom McCloskey, talk about an interesting character. The only thing I heard as a kid, now my mother and my grandmother are both born and raised here, and all I heard about McCloskey was, oh, he was just a drunk. Oh, he was more than that. And there's always another side of the story. He kept good order. He catered to the more respectable customers. He was Canadian ex-heavyweight prize fighter. Nobody's going to mess with him. But he was a good businessman who won the respect of most people. He would loan money when people were down and out. Later, when Theo Alexander's family operated a restaurant, they had a mural, and you can still see that mural in that building today. When they are open, you probably can look through the window if you're downtown on Concho. It shows citizens standing at the bar. The mural was painted from an old photograph made by M.C. Ragsdale. The mural is still there. Visitors are welcome. Now, Fairmont Cemetery has a statue of McCloskey that his wife arranged to have made by Frank Teisch. And the symbol of the Knights of Pythias, a fraternal organization, members were to be humanitarians, is carved into the pedestal of the statue. And as you go in the front, if you veer to the left, you can't miss the statue. His wife commissioned it. And this is, Teisch is from Llano. And you may have seen this Weeping Angel is in Scottsville, Texas. Isn't that beautiful? He was a wonderful sculptor. And that historical marker's on the Llano Courthouse Square. Stop and read next time and say, I know about Frank. I learned that one of the first banks was opened by Daniel and Anton Oppenheimer of San Antonio. Opened a mercantile store, and they also let people borrow money, or they bought things on commission and then they give them cattle, or, you know, in the old days, the doctor would get chickens. But anyway, San Antonio Associates of Marcus. And so they were here about 10 years. Alex Konenheim was the manager. The brother was manager of this bank. That bank stayed in San Antonio until 1988. D and A Oppenheimer bankers. And one of the Oppenheimer descendants married a Joski. They're all just, yeah. We all know about, don't y'all miss Joskis? Yes. All right, Johnson & Taylor, established in 1883 at their building. Johnson & Taylor, they dissolved that partnership in 1908, and the store continued under Taylor. Johnson was from Tennessee, brother of J. Willis Johnson. Y'all may be familiar with that, before becoming a merchant. Clint was a freighter, ditch digger, store clerk for J.L. Millspaw and W.S. Beck, and Clint was also in business with John Nasworthy. All these names, y'all know and hear all the time. In 1904, Clint, along with Lewis Lee Farr, Claude Broom, J.W. Hill, and Brown Lee, bought Fort Concho for $35 an acre after the fort was abandoned. And he was also a rancher and a banker. These are some of his ads. James Blakely Taylor was an owner of a grocery store and brother of Francis C. Taylor, the division manager of the mail station. The mother had died in Tennessee, and so brothers, the dad, and a sister all came to San Angelo. Their father died in the 82 flood, and he was on a roof of the house with Mrs. Metcalf and her daughter when the floods took the house. Now, the Taylor drug specialized in unusual things. Oysters. Now, how did it get from the coast here? Of course, ice became a thing, so, but that, taking your chance by eating oysters. But these are great ads. He had Rose's lime juice in quart bottles, Rose's lime juice in pint bottles. We had root beer extract, Robertson's grape juice, lemonade, spring water, Quaker puffed rice. The finest line of lunch goods west of Fort Worth. Beginning today, I will handle fresh fish and oysters and all vegetables and fruits in season. The finest line of lunch goods. I always thought that was interesting. Finest line of lunch goods. Don't you wish you could go in the store? Okay, Schwartz and Ross building. Still standing. The original store inventory included dry goods, clothing, and groceries. Louis Schwartz immigrated from Germany in 1871 and arrived in San Angelo in 1879. Ross became a business partner around 1884. Schwartz and Ross built their store in 1886. They were very successful in doing as much as $1,000 per day in the 1880s. The ranchers would come in and they would buy 6 months worth of flour and coffee and sugar and probably clothing. A lot of times it would be bought on consignment. They would either sheep herders sell their wool or sell their cattle and come back and pay their bill. The partnership ended in 1895. I found it interesting. Ross moved to California, and then Schwartz continued sales in a different location in town as L. Schwartz and Company. He partnered with Leo Mossbacher until the business was sold in 1909 to Baker Hemphill. Schwartz eventually moved to New York City and became a real estate agent. Ross moved to California, where he became a merchant in the wholesale liquor, and at his death in 1928 was the head of the Lyons California Glacé Candied Fruit Company, the largest of its kind in the world. This is the building. It's still standing. This was L. Schwartz and Company. This is a major belief in San Angelo, building a major building like this, 2 stories. And there it is today. So when you go by there, think of it as Schwartz and Company, then it became Baker Hemphill. And then, of course, Baker Hemphill built a big building where the library sits today. Now that is the very last building that Hemphill's, and I still have my credit card. So, okay. Asa Frary, general merchandise store on the corner of Concho and Chadbourn, parking lot across from Angry Cactus. Asa dealt in buffalo hides. And buffalo hunters, when they came to town, were dangerous people. And they did not like the black soldiers and would shoot them if they caught them in a saloon. They'd get mad, shoot them, and then leave town and get away with it. It's rough place when the buffalo hunters, and then smelly. In 1879, the market for buffalo hides was gone, and an acre of unsold hides were stacked east of Concho Avenue and left to rot. Yeah. All right. Asa married Clarissa Tankersley, daughter of the first rancher. Asa and Clarissa had 3 children, but none lived to adulthood. Daughters Josie and Hattie were killed in a tragic, they were teenagers, and Asa had died. Clarissa took the girls for a vacation, I'm sure, to Galveston, and the girls were killed in a tragic accident. The value of the property of Mrs. Frary at her death was $59,000, equivalent to over $1 million today. Early investments of Mr. Frary and there's a Frary addition in San Angelo. Okay, Lisa Bobo. Did y'all know B stood for Bobo Harris? Yeah. Oh, got a relative sitting right there. Okay. LB became a Texas Ranger in 1845, then owned a freight business, then became a cattleman. He arrived in the county in 1876 and bought land in the Great Creek in Coke County. The family moved to San Angelo and purchased property from Marcus Koningheim in order to build the first wooden frame home in San Angelo. The street where the house was built became Harris Street, that still exists today. And we're still looking for good pictures of the Harris houses. Harris established the Concho National Bank located at the southwest corner of Oaks and Concho, where Eggemeyer's is today. Harris was the president of the bank. In 1884, LB built the San Angelo Hotel on Beauregard. And that man right there has a picture of the hotel. And I need to get it from him. Harris went into partnership with Eugene Cartledge and Sterling Robertson to set up a mercantile store. And there's an ad. 8 children were born to LB and his wife Martha. Adeline, Walter, Mary, Clara, Wayne, Nancy, Frank, and Ralph. And there are a lot of descendants of the Harrises. Anybody besides? This is a picture of the south side. The Nimitz is on one end. This is the other side. The Concho National Bank is right there on the corner. And that's where Eggemeyer sits today. Now, what's happening across the street is they're building the Vec building. Those are stonemasons building the Vec building. The big 2-story had a corner entrance. That's cool to come across that. The San Angelo National Bank, now we know it as Miss Hattie's. First president was R.B. Sanderson. The bank moved to a new site in 1902 in the southwest corner of Chadbourn and Tuig. Became too small. The building was torn down, and this building was built. And now it stands empty, unfortunately. It went through restructuring and organization, of course, during the Depression. This is what Concho Avenue looked like before people had a dream to redevelop the history of Concho Avenue. Isn't that sad looking? And I never saw Concho Avenue as a kid. I was born here in 1952, we didn't go downtown. We went to Hemp Hills, which was on Burgard, but I never saw Concho Avenue. It was a rough place, had rough businesses, some of you probably remember. But thank goodness they restored these buildings, and Concho Avenue is a happening place. James Millspaugh arrived at Fort Concho in 1871. He taught school at the fort. He was appointed post sutler and later became a government contractor. Was one of the 5 commissioners to help organize Tom Green County, served as a justice of the peace, and appointed postmaster at Fort Concho. He built an ice factory using electricity. City incorporated and hired him to install the fire hydrants. He was never paid because the people, saloon keepers, didn't like the taxes, so they voted to unincorporate, and he never got paid. Now I live across the street from a mill spa. So he produced 5,000 pounds of ice, and that was not enough for the town. The sign that goes, you're going east off of the main road, off of Koningheim, and you're turning right and you're going down Concho Avenue, going east. And there is an office building. Well, first you come to the Y, and then you come to an office building on the right. The ice station was in that location, okay? And I found a drawing of the ice factory. Now, I always wondered what the pole was in the photo. They're standing on the water tank to take this picture, and people, when this is posted online, they're all going, where was that person taking the picture from? Well, now we know. Standing on the water tower, and the pole that lets out the steam and the heat from the boilers, you know, creating the electricity, that's the pole in the picture. So now you can tell, yep, right here. So the ice station is right there. And I think that's my great-grandfather's house. He built it in 1883. This picture was taken in 1884, and it was first house in East San Angelo. Charles Blakely Metcalf arrived in 1873 and worked for his uncle at the Concho Mail Station. He helped engineer and build dams, raised sheep and cattle. His ranch was called the XQZ. Ranch is now 5-acre estates. Anyone have their state? All right, out there, he served as county commissioner for 6 years and was a Texas legislator for 4. His only son, Penrose, was a state legislator. He was partners with Millspaugh in the waterworks system for the town of San Angelo. He survived the '82 Ben Ficklin flood, but lost his sister and his mother in the flood. We're lucky that we had such movers and shakers and believed in this town and invested. All right, I've already talked about Morkins. He taught school in San Angelo in a picket house on Tuig. He owned a general merchandise store. He married and had children, was bankrupt by 1885, moved to California. Lundquist was raised in Fredericksburg and a tinner, setting up and operating fabricating machine to cut, bend, and straighten metal. Windmills are starting to be, and tanks, or water tanks are being established. He would later work for Wendland, which is a whole nother story in itself. Wendland used to work for Finlater. Wendland's first business, that building is still standing downtown, and it has a marker on it. Oh, I love this guy, and I can't tell you the story. My brother and I were talking about it. Well, I'll tell you anyway. Okay. It's really funny. I'd forgotten about the story. My brother was visiting my grandmother and he forgot to zip up his pants after going to the bathroom. And my grandmother says, "Don't be like Mr. Prizer, zip up your pants." I guess Mr. Prizer forgot to zip up his pants. Anyway, would you believe he's the first photographer? Ragsdale's not the first photographer. Prizer was. He had his own business down in the Dumransville area. He's born in Germany, had a thick German accent, and there's funny stories about how he had his own law of the Conchos. You know, heard of the law of the West? Well, he had the law of the Conchos. He and Caroline, he came to be a stonemason, but he had been a photographer, and so he saw an opportunity, moved his material here. He had 11 children with the first wife, and then he married again, and then she had 4 children. And one of those stepdaughters married John Nasworthy. That's cool, you know. He served on the county school board, Precinct 2 county commissioner, and was justice of the peace. He was also elected the first mayor of incorporated San Angelo, and he lived to be the age of 87 and is buried in Deming, New Mexico, where his son worked and lived. And, you know, they're not going to bring him back to bury. But Prizer's youngest son, Oscar, married a great aunt of mine, and he abandoned her with 4 kids. And she was just, you find her on the census, just living all over Texas, just destitute. All right, Mr. Ragsdale was a native of South Carolina. Family left the Civil War and settled in Bell County. MC's father was a doctor. The plan was to go to college, but finances led him to drop out. MC then became an itinerant photographer traveling all over Central Texas, and he arrived in San Angelo in 1875 and set up the photography shop. He married Mary Weber. Her father was listed as a barber. They built a 2-story building on the corner of Chadbourne and Concho that served as a studio and living quarters. Some of you still may remember that building. 2 sons, Arthur and Henry, and a daughter, Helen. He sold his studio to James Cravey. 2,500 prints survive, but the original glass, they were all destroyed. So the 2,500 prints are at Fort Concho, but there's still tidbits out. He did lots of portraits. They lived to the age of 95. And this was the building. This is a parking lot across from the Angry Cactus. And that building was torn down in 1959. It was a 1-story, then they added to it, and the Ragsdales, I believe, lived on the 2nd floor.
Where is that again?
This building was located at the corner of Concho and Chadbourne. And Angry Cactus is on the south side. This would be north of the Angry Cactus, and that's a parking lot. Okay, if you have any saddles with these names, you've got a treasure on your hands. John Ford Dunn. Harness, and when you look at the 1885 Sanborn maps, harness makers, I found 4 locations for harness makers. You know, leather working was big in early days. But John Ford Dunn saddlery was on Concho. He had the Cattle Queen saddle. Andrews and Coleman worked there. So Jim Coleman was a native of Lampasas. He sold out to Bernie Alexander. Henry Hagelstein, the Hagelsteins were a group of families that had a livery, and they had all kinds of businesses. And Henry sold out to B.C. Alexander. B.C. Alexander sold his portion to R.J. Andrew. Andrew had been working for, see, they're all interconnected, learning from one another. So these are some of the ads. And then, of course, we know about Donahoe, and that name is still being used in San Angelo. But these are just some of the ads. Important, but if you find any of these saddles with those names, those are a treasure. And some saddles go for $3,000 and $4,000. Kind of like spurs go for $12,000 from the original people, I found out. Drugstores. No block, German, and he was not well liked. He refused to help people if they owed him money. And the unhappy townspeople forced the doctor to sit astride a rail and paraded him around town. See ya. Then Dr. Layton came in, and he had a business on the southeast corner of Concho Avenue, which is parking lot. Location is east of Egermars. You know, there were lots of business that went in and out across from Egermars, east of Egermars. Dr. West, partner in business, died, and West moved to Brown County. And then Samuel Smith, he's native of Indiana, and he was a physician at the fort, and he decided to stay. And he remained a beloved local physician, druggist, postmaster, school board member, county health officer, Elks Lodge member, and a Mason. He married Elizabeth Potter in 1882, and his house was located today where the parking garage for the oncology center is. That's where his house was. And I have a picture of the original, and then a picture of the old one, of the one that was torn down. Lurch and, when you hear the word lurch, do you think of? Thank you, Munsters, Lurch and Landrum. Early land and insurance agents. Lurch was a native of Prussia, a surveyor, livestock commission broker, and went into business with Landrum. Landrum was from Virginia and lived at Ben Ficklin and was a school teacher and farmer. They advertised lots of different places, Galveston, Fort Worth, Topeka, Kansas, encouraging people to come to San Angelo. Oh, I love this guy. Silas Wright, Titus, windmill man of West Texas. He was a trained engineer and ended up in San Angelo. And this business was where the cactus now stands. Northwest corner, Toogan Oaks. Whoops, misspelled that. Silas drilled the first test well for oil. He believed there was oil here. He drilled for John Nasworthy. He went 800 feet. Now, one story says they struck oil, another one says, nah. So, he said there's oil in West Texas. It was not until 1942 when they found it. Silas left, went to Brooklyn, New York, and was in charge of the Brooklyn water system, a $3 million water system, and he was in charge. That was cool. He also had 7 patents for lifting water out of the ground. And you may not know that there was an 1890 survey done of Civil War veterans living in San Angelo. And there is Silas Titus as a bugler. He was a bugler during the Civil War for the Northern Army. I think his contacts with his father helped. His father was a colonel. And to keep the kid in safe hands, he became a bugler. That's a cool, if you come to my genealogy class, then you'll learn how to find this stuff. The newspaper. James Kibbe. And there were Kibbe actors that were kin to this man. There were 2 men who, I can't remember their acting names, but they used Kibbe as their last name. He's all of age 22 when he arrived in San Angelo. And it was called the Concho Times, and then it became the Tom Green Times. Kibbe sold the paper in 1884, but he would continue to own newspapers in other places. 2 of his brothers, Milton Kibbe and Guy Kibbe, and you might go look at, I didn't recognize them, they were character actors. Now, Pat Murphy and W.A. Guthrie became the new owners, and the paper's name became the Standard, San Angelo Weekly Standard. Guthrie and the editorial writer-printer, and Pat was the reporter. I did not know that the rooster, which I grew up in Borden County, and we always got the San Angelo paper, and there was a red rooster. And I always knew it meant rain. I didn't know it was 1910 when it was introduced. You knew it was that old?
Sergeant Rains.
Sergeant Rains. And that was a name, they had a contest, and they named the rooster.
R-A-I-N-Z, Rains.
Rains.
Whenever it rained, he was on the front of the paper.
Front of the paper. And that symbol is still on, when you look up San Angelo Standard, that rooster is still symbolic of the times. Now, at Concho Avenue Mercantile Store, the Lapowski brothers, Sam, Jacob, and Nathan, they also had stores in Abilene, Colorado City, and Durham, which is in my home county. And Durham was, if you know where the town of Gale is, Gale wasn't the first town, Durham was, and the Lapowskis had a store there. The brothers immigrated from Poland, and an interesting part of the Lapowski family history involves Sam's son Clarence, who changed his last name to Dillon and became one of the wealthiest men in America. And he also served in one of the presidents, I think Eisenhower's time in the White House. Oh, I love Mr. Dressler. August Gustav Dressler arrived in San Angelo as a baker. He had been in the U.S. Army. After his work with the military, opened a bakery next to the Nimitz Hotel, and his building was also a saloon and a grocery store. He sold bread for 25 cents for 7 loaves, 25 cents for a glass of whiskey. I have a feeling there was more whiskey sold. All right. Flour came from San Antonio, and he used fermented potatoes in the place of yeast when yeast wasn't readily available. He sold his business in 1902 and moved to Sweetwater, where he continued baking. But Gustav's buried here. I think that's pretty cool. And that shows the bakery next to the Nimitz. Oh, Oscar's house. It's right over here. And he and Houston Hart thought that house, I can't imagine why, was not welcome downtown. It's right there, not too far from the Myers Drug, where it was located. He lived there, and his office was there. And Oscar, that's another story in itself. Oscar he wore the same clothes every day. He ate the same food at the same cafe every day. He invested in San Angelo, and at his death, he was worth about $500,000. He started business in Austin with his brother, and they built Old Main. It was their architecture firm that built Old Main at the University of Texas. Some of their buildings still stand. And of course, he came because he is the architect and contractor for the brand new courthouse. And thank goodness they saved that building, because you can see how humble Oscar was. Claude Broom, and I passed through Broom on my way up north, and there's a little, can't miss it, a little sign that says Broom, and it's named for this family. His first job was assistant county clerk, but he purchased 10,000 acres of the Tankersley Ranch, where he ran sheep and cattle, became very wealthy, established an insurance business that became the Meadows, Fisher, and Clear business. And the house that Broom built, well, he didn't build it, he actually bought it. That house is still standing. The Freeze Building, 1887, it was one of the oldest buildings in San Angelo, one of the oldest stone buildings still standing. It was built by Peter Freeze, who was a blacksmith and wheelwright. The building then was used as a stable, grocery store, saloon, offices, auto repair, furniture warehouse, and a loan company. And the Sugg family owns that building now, but it's a wonderful building. Can't have early San Angelo without George B. Jackson. I'm hoping Suzanne Campbell's working on the book on him. Born into slavery, joined the Army and became a Buffalo soldier. He and his wife Mary purchased town lots and land in Tom Green County, and they were astute business people. He was a community leader and investor, and George was involved in politics. He even addressed the Republican State Convention in 1894. Statistic, 19.4 gallons of whiskey per male annually. And if you have a chance, Ross McSwain wrote a wonderful story about George. The Nimitz, I've already mentioned him. He actually built a second. There's the Nimitz on Concho, where the townhouse is now standing. he actually sold that property to the Landon, and the Landon, I don't have a picture of the Landon Hotel that was built, and then it burned and people died, and then they built another one, and then, it's a bad karma corner there, unfortunately. I wish we could do something to that. This is Nemitz's second business, and it was on Tuhig. And I could go on, but I won't. Thanks.